Hey, church family. Hope you're having a great day on this Thursday. And we are actually picking back up in a study that we started yesterday. Actually, it started several weeks ago. We were in a study on our Wednesday night class before all this quarantine stuff happened, and we were walking through the study of the Sermon on the Mount. We were studying the Sermon on the Mount, walking through Jesus' words there in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And so yesterday we picked back up in that study, and we specifically started looking at Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5 verses 17 through 20. And again, if you didn't get to listen to yesterday's message, I would encourage you to listen to that. Maybe you can just push pause on this one and go back and listen to the one yesterday, because it kind of sets things up for today. So let me go ahead and read the passage, and then we'll get into the rest of our study today. Here's what Jesus says. Matthew chapter 5 verses 17 through 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And in many ways, that's kind of where we left off yesterday, as we were talking about that idea when Jesus says those words, those words in that last verse, in verse 20. It really was a bombshell in many ways for the people listening, because the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they ate, they slept, they drank. I mean, they breathed. It was their life to teach and know the law, and they had it down to a T, every dot and tittle, every iota, every accent mark. And yet Jesus comes along and says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And the people said, well, what hope is there? And so Jesus is, and when we talked about what part of what Jesus is saying is, no, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they think they know the righteousness that God desires, but really they don't. They're off base. And so the question that I left you with yesterday is, what is the righteousness that God desires? What does that look like? What is the righteousness that God is talking about? What is a righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law? Well, again, I'm glad you asked. And I don't have all the answers. I want to be clear on that. But here's maybe a couple of things that I think Scripture speaks to that are a few aspects of this righteousness that God is looking for and that he desires from us as his followers. First of all, I think the righteousness that God is looking for is a righteousness that goes deep. A righteousness that has some depth to it. It's not a surface level righteousness. It's the righteousness that really goes deep. If you look at the rest of Matthew chapter 5 and what Jesus is about to say, he gives 6 real world, everyday life examples of what the kind of righteousness that he's talking about looks like. And in each and every circumstance that he talks about, his focus really is not so much on the outside, not so much on the external behavior, but on the inside and what's going on the inside. For instance, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, what do you do when you're at odds with someone? Jesus says, you've heard it was said, do not murder. Just make sure you don't murder. But I say, watch your anger and work toward reconciliation. Not just behavior, but heart, right? Next issue, adultery, verses 27 through 30. What do you do when you're tempted with that scenario? Jesus says, well, you've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery. I'm telling you, no, don't even look lustfully. Don't even cultivate that desire. You've heard it said it's more about physical contact, right? And don't commit adultery physically, but I'm saying it's not just about the behavior, but it's also about the heart. Next issue, marriage, verses 31 through 32. What do you do when you're unhappy with your spouse? Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, all you have to do is make sure you get a certificate for divorce. But I say, God sees through the paper. Next issue, oaths. and giving your word, verses 33 through 37. What do you do when you want to be believed? Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, keep your oath if you make it. You can make an oath, just keep it. But I say, speak truth always, and you won't need an oath. Next issue in verses 38 through 42. How do you react to someone who's done you wrong? Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, inflict the same injury on the offender. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, turn the other cheek. Go the extra mile. And then the last section of Matthew chapter 5, loving your enemies. Verses 43 through 48. Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemies. But I say, love and even bless your enemies. And so much of what Jesus has to say has to do with our heart and not just our behavior. Anger, lust, divorce, honesty, reacting to those who have hurt you, how you treat your enemies, those all have to do with heart issues, either attitudes of the heart or God attending to the heart or having to get your heart engaged if you're going to pull off that command. And certainly we're going to walk through each of those teachings over the, however many weeks that we are together, or even in our Wednesday night Bible class. But I just, right now, I just want you to see that common theme. Jesus pushes beyond a focus on external behavior, and he gets down to the heart of the matter, which is the matter of the heart. And I think one of the problems is that when our focus is on an external righteousness and on external behavior, it's very easy for our mindset to become, okay, well, what's enough to where I can get by and still be righteous? Where's the line? If I know the line, I know where I have to either get to or it's a line I can't cross. How far is too far? How much is enough? Makes me think of a comic strip I saw where one of the main characters had taken a test in school and he needed a 60 to pass. And when he got the test back, he got a 68 and he said, what a waste. I got 8 points I didn't even need. And so, Jesus is confronting that mindset that says, what's the absolute minimum that I can get by with when it comes to the external righteousness and external behavior? And when Jesus says that our righteousness has to surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, it really was deflating to everybody, because it was setting them incredibly high. Excuse me, sorry about the cough. That's 1,613 commandments that I've got to obey, right? At the very least. But that's not the righteousness that Jesus is talking about. That the righteousness Jesus is talking about, and I think this is so important for us to understand, the righteousness that Jesus is talking about is not about being more obedient. It's about having a deeper obedience. He's focused on an internal righteousness that comes from the heart and arises out of the heart to transform our behavior, because it's only through our hearts being changed and being shaped into the people that God wants us to be that we truly experience a change in our behavior. Because we live from the heart. For better or worse, you live from your heart. That's why you can't simply impose change from the outside. And so Jesus pays attention first to the inside, since that's ultimately where we live from, and that's where the leverage for real transformation and real change comes from. I like how a guy named Dallas Willard puts it. He said, Jesus knew that we cannot keep the law by trying to keep the law. Let me say that again. Jesus knew that we cannot keep the law by trying to keep the law. To succeed, one must aim at something other and something more. One must aim to become the kind of person from whom the deeds of the law naturally flow. An apple tree naturally and easily produces apples because of its inner nature. This is the most crucial thing to remember if we would understand Jesus' picture of the kingdom heart given in the Sermon on the Mount. The righteousness that Jesus is aiming for is from the inside out. It's more about becoming on the inside than it is doing on the outside. And as you set your mind and your heart on the becoming, the doing will take care of itself. Because Jesus shows us that God is looking for a righteousness that goes deep. But it's not just a righteousness that goes deep, it's also one that goes wide. It's not just about going deep in our hearts, it's also about going wide when it comes to our relationships and how we interact with others. Every single one of Jesus's examples that I just mentioned earlier, they all have to do with how we relate to others. In Jesus's day, many people thought that the righteousness that God was all about was just a vertical righteousness, right? And so it's just about making sure that everything's cool between me and God. Everything's kosher between me and God. And so when you inside the temple, what you did inside, the church building worshiping God, that was more important than what you did on the outside of the temple and worshiping God. Inside the temple and making sure that you look the part was more important than what you did on the outside and how you interacted with others. But Jesus comes along and he says, righteousness isn't just a vertical issue. It's not just about between you and God. It's also a horizontal issue with how you treat others and how you interact with others, because God considers how you treat others in many ways as how you treat him. I mean, you just think about what Jesus says is the greatest command, which is interesting because sometimes we think of it as the greatest commands, but it's really the greatest command. There are two parts, but it's really just one command because they are inextricably intertwined and connected to one another. And so when the expert in the law asked Jesus what the greatest command is out of all the 613 commands, Jesus says the greatest command is this: love the Lord with all your God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, they go together. Because God isn't just looking for a righteousness that goes deep, he's also looking for a righteousness that goes wide and impacts how we interact and treat and respond to those around us. But ultimately, a righteousness that goes deep and a righteousness that goes wide is all tied together through a righteousness that is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. Because that's what brings everything together. A righteousness that goes deep and a righteousness that goes wide is not even possible without a righteousness that is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. The more you read through the Sermon on the Mount, the more you begin to realize that the life that Jesus is calling us to is impossible to pull off in and of ourselves. Our hearts are woefully short of the standard. We don't have what it takes inside in and of ourselves, and yet we can take heart because, need I remind you, the very first words in the Sermon on the Mount out of Jesus' mouth in Matthew chapter 5 verse 3, when he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That's Jesus' very first words, and it's really the foundation that he builds everything else off of, because he wants us to be reminded that as we go deeper into his teaching, we're going to realize more and more that we don't have what it takes in and of ourselves. We are spiritually bankrupt. We don't have the resources in and of ourselves to love our enemies or to control our tongue or to control our lust or to seek his kingdom first and his righteousness first. We don't have the resources in and of ourselves to fill in the blank. And yet the Sermon on the Mount keeps driving us back to Jesus' very first words: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, the spiritually bankrupt, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And so we can take heart because he came to bring the saving and delivering and transforming power of God to the poor in spirit, to those who are spiritually bankrupt, to all of us who realize that we are sinners and that we don't have what it takes in and of ourselves to live up to that standard. Now, that being said, while Jesus came to set us free from sin and free from the bondage of sin, he did not come to set us free from living righteously. There are some that believe that that's the way to go, and that's what Jesus is calling us to, and to live that way. Jesus did what he did in his life and his death and his resurrection to set us free from sin, not to set us free from having to live righteously, right? And so, it's not just about that we are set free from something, but we are also set free for something. Because you and I are not set free from having to live righteously, from having to live obediently. Here's the key, though. Living righteously and obediently isn't the source of our righteousness, but it is the course of our righteousness. Does that make sense? And so living righteously and obediently isn't the goal, nor is it the source from which we live, but it is the course, it is the path on which we live as we are walking out this relationship, this intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. It's the source, because if it's the source of our righteousness, then we are all in deep trouble. Because we've all broken too many commandments to count. Jesus is the source of our righteousness. And he's come to bring the kingdom of heaven to the poor in spirit. And so obedience, again, is not the source of our righteousness. Jesus is the source of our righteousness, but it is the course of our righteousness. And Jesus came not to set us free from living righteously and obediently. He came to pay the penalty for all the times when we don't live righteously and obediently. And then to give us the insight and the power to begin to live righteously and obediently. Because the source of our righteousness is through him. And the reality is the only way to pull off living out the Sermon on the Mount is to go the radical way of following Jesus Christ. Radical because he's come to take us back to the root of what God intended all along. And because of that, Jesus is the root to living the life that God desires us to live. And to do that, Jesus takes us into the root of our lives, which is our hearts. Because that's where we live from, for better or for worse. And he changes us at the root so that we can bear a different fruit and truly live the life that he calls us to live. But truly living that life can only be found through allowing Jesus to go deep into our hearts and into our lives. Hope you have a blessed day. God bless.